Okay, well, let's pray and we'll get started. Gracious Father, we thank you for the opportunity to gather together and to talk about books and talk about stories, talk about things that matter only because of Christ, who entered into our world, became a part of the story that you are writing and brought us in to be a part of that story. We thank you for that. We ask that you would be pleased tonight by what we talk about, that it would be useful to your growing us up as the church and into the kingdom. And Father, we dedicate it to you in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
Well, a little disclaimer to start out. I was never formally trained in good reading. I never learned how to read, per se, at least not to play off my title, The Art of Reading. But I was blessed by God with a love of reading. And so really what I learned just came about from lots of reading. I read a lot, and as I read a lot, some of these things just started to work in me, and I intuitively started to learn how to read the right way. What I appreciate about some of the works I'll cite tonight is where they were helpful to me is to really put words to that learning and hone that and refine that skill. And I think that's the helpful part, is for us to become intentional again about how we read and the purpose of reading and to do it the right way. And so I'm coming at it from someone who is very joyful that we can again begin to teach in a very formal way this lost art. In Ray Bradbury's classic Fahrenheit 451, Professor Faber holds up a very rare copy of the Bible, and he explains to Guy Montag the magic of books. He says, "Do you know why books such as this are so important? Because they have quality. And what does the word quality mean? To me, it means texture. This book has pores. It has features. This book can go under the microscope. You find life under the glass, streaming past in infinite profusion. The more pores, the more truthfully recorded details of life per square inch you can get on a sheet of paper, the more literary you are." That's my definition anyway. Telling detail, fresh detail. The good writers touch life often. The mediocre ones run a quick hand over her. The bad ones rape her and leave her for the flies. Books really are an amazing gift. There really is a magic to them, because books are really a gift from God to us, to his people. In the early 1800s, and by the way, this is before compulsory education. This is before they made kids go to school for a large portion of their lives. The literacy rate was around 98% in cities such as Boston, in the high 90s in most urban areas. And that was combined with a high ability to read at a high level of comprehension. Now, it's been noted many times by many people that the Federalist Papers, for example, were newspaper articles that were written to convince the average citizen to support the Constitution. It won't take long for you to glance at the Federalist Papers to realize what a high level of comprehension they assumed their audience had when they wrote those. Now the literacy rate is somewhere between 65 and 85%. And the average American reads at a 5th to 7th grade level. It's no coincidence then that most popular American fiction is written at a 7th grade reading level. Names like John Grisham, Tom Clancy, Stephen King, Michael Crichton, all of those are written at a 7th grade level. It's no coincidence that romance novels are written at a 5th grade level. Now, this is not necessarily a test of good literature versus poorly written literature. We do not base the quality of literature based upon the grade level. For example, Huckleberry Finn is written at a 5th grade level as well. But what it does tell you is the mass market, where they want to sell lots of books, they know their audience. They know who's reading their books and who's going to buy their books. Reader's Digest and Time, around a 9th grade level. The New York Times is around a 10th grade level. Better Homes and Gardens is around 11th grade level. However, our goal is simply not to increase our literacy rate. It's not even to increase the grade level at which we read. Our goal must be higher than that. Mortimer Adler once called the act of reading the taking part in the great conversation. The great conversation of ideas that began in ancient times and has continued unbroken even to the present. Now, as Christians, I think we would say that it's a taking part in that divine drama, that story with the triune God as the author and the incarnate Word, Jesus, as its main character. We want to be part of this story because it is, as his people, our story. Those of us who want to be a part of that conversation, who want to go on learning and discovering and growing long after any formal education has ceased, need to know how to make books speak to us. We need to learn how to ask the right questions and listen to the stories and ideas being communicated and then let them have a formative effect on our lives. We need to let books talk to us. According to Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to his nephew, all you need are a shelf full of books, a friend or two who can talk to you about your reading, and some time. So let's begin there. So first of all, you need some books. We'll talk about one genre in particular tonight, but there are several other genres well worth your time. So as you decide what books to read, what books to stock your shelves with, what books to have on your nightstand, let me encourage you to mix in your reading with a steady diet of both fiction and poetry and nonfiction, particularly history and biography and theology. I would also remind you what Ed talked about last time, C.S. Lewis's instruction to read for every new book at least one old book. At the minimum, an old book for every new. I'd also suggest that having a friend or two to talk about the reading is perhaps the most neglected aspect of good reading. James Sire, in his book, How to Read Slowly, says that a reading partner forces you to use words precisely and to define your terms. That to begin to talk about the book with someone else really forces you to think rightly about it. You probably can't do that with every book you read, but I think if you'll give it a try with some particularly good books, you'll notice a remarkable difference in the results. As Adler says, there's a big difference between remembering something in a book and being able to explain it. And the last thing you need is time. The art of reading is not a casual, passive, convenient discipline. You have to give undivided attention to the book. Again, remember, it's a conversation. It can't be a distracted conversation. Even if you only have 15 minutes a day, carve out that 15 minutes and let it be an undistracted 15 minutes. And to do that, you have to avoid some of the common temptations that fight for our attention. Phones laying on the table as you read, or checking the email before you start the book, or getting another project started and then trying to sit down and read. There are things that pull at us constantly, and we have to fight against that. So let me just give you a few basic approaches to reading, and then I want to give some particulars in the genre of fiction, just as an example. My hope tonight is just to give you a little bit of a taste of how to do this, and I've cited some works at the end of your notes to continue on in that learning process. In How to Read a Book, Mortimer Adler describes 4 levels of reading. He says there's elementary, which is your basic level, and it simply asks the question, what's it say? What's the book say? The second is inspectional reading, which is skimming. It's what's the book about? What kind of book is it? Look at the title, look at the table of contents, look at the blurb on the back, know a little bit something about the author. It's a skimming. The third level is analytical, and that's a complete understanding. That's a complete understanding of what the book is saying. And then the fourth is syntopical, which is a comparative, meaning you're bringing in other information, bringing in other insights, other ideas, and comparing them to what the book itself is saying. Susan Wise Bauer, in her book, The Well-Educated Mind, plays off of a famous quote by Francis Bacon, and she structures her approach around the stages of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Bacon said this. He said, some books are to be tasted, others to be swallowed, and some few to be chewed and digested. Now, the first thing I want you to notice is that all books should not be created or treated equally. We are not egalitarians when it comes to books. Some books deserve to not be finished. Some books deserve and probably even just require simple skimming. Some are to be consumed and carefully understood, and some few are to be to feed and grow your soul. It really depends on the kind of book, and it depends on your purpose in reading it. I want to look briefly at Bauer's 3 levels of understanding, this taste, swallow, and digest, as she puts it. And she says true reading is to first taste the book, and that's to gain a basic knowledge of your subject. Second is to swallow, to take the knowledge into your own understanding by evaluating it. You're going to begin now to ask questions of it. Is it valid? Is it true? Why is it true? Why is it not true? And then thirdly, you're going to digest the book. You're going to fold the subject into your own understanding. You're going to let it change the way you think, or you're going to reject it as unworthy. Either way, whether you accept it and allow it to change you, or you reject it as untrue, both ways is going to have a formative shaping of your life. And I think we've unfortunately replaced the art of reading with the presumption of many words read and many opinions formed without ever having swallowed anything, much less digested the meaning behind the words. Let me give you some words from Dorothy Sayers in her essay, The Lost Tools of Learning. She said this, "For we let our young men and women go out unarmed, in a day when armor was never so necessary. By teaching them all to read, we have left them at the mercy of the printed word. By the invention of the film and the radio, we have made certain that no aversion to reading shall secure them from the incessant battery of words, words, words." So even if they don't like to read, they can't escape words now, because words aren't just contained and confined in books anymore. They do not know what the words mean. They do not know how to ward them off or blunt their edge or fling them back. They are a prey to words and their emotions instead of being the masters of them in their intellects. That's the danger of reading without truly reading. To teach a child to read without really teaching a child the art of reading is just to simply make that child susceptible to the dangers of words. So let's look at this genre of fiction and take us through the grammar, the logic, the rhetoric, the taste, swallow, and digest stages. The first level of reading is the grammar stage. Most of us are familiar with this stage, and honestly, we consider it the sum total of reading. Listen how C.S. Lewis describes most readers in his book on reading entitled An Experiment in Criticism. He says, in the first place, the majority never read anything twice. The sure mark of an unliterary man is that he considers, I've read it already, to be a conclusive argument against reading a work. We have all known women who remembered a novel so dimly that they had to stand for half an hour in the library skimming through it before they were certain that they had read it once. But the moment they became certain, they rejected it immediately. It was for them dead, like a burnt-out match, an old railway ticket, or yesterday's paper. They'd already used it. Those who read the great works, on the other hand, will read the same work 10, 20, or 30 times during the course of their life. We are consumer readers. We consume books. We do not digest books. We consume it and we're ready to move to the next. We've had our meal, we're ready for something new. And Lewis says, no, you need to eat and feed on it over and over and over again. Reading any book on any level beyond the elementary is essentially an effort on your part to ask it questions and then to answer it to the best of your ability. This is what we would call a Socratic method, that we question the book and then we have the book to answer our questions for us. And you're doing the work on both parts. And this requires that we become serious readers. So in the grammar stage, what we want to do is we want to get a sense of the story as a whole. We want to taste it. And to do that, we would suggest that you would just read steady straight through it. Don't get bogged down in lots of characters. Don't get bogged down in some things that you don't understand. Don't get your dictionary out and look up every word that you don't understand. Just get in the story and just read through it. And let the book develop and carry you along. A lot of the things you will struggle with initially in a book. For instance, I remember in some of the works I would read, like the Brothers Karamazov. I remember the first time I tried to read that. He just bombards you with characters. I'm trying to keep all the characters straight. I'm trying to figure out who's who and who's what and what's going on. And a lot of times, if you'll just read through, if you'll press through that, the main characters will kind of rise to the surface. They'll come to the top, and you'll kind of see that as you go. Secondly, you need to identify the writer's relationship to the material. Is it satiric? Is it facetious? Are they being humorous? Are they just laying it on straight? How are they relating to the material? Again, let me give you some words from Lewis. He says, "Now the true reader reads every work seriously in the sense that he reads it wholeheartedly. He makes himself as receptive as he can. But for that reason, he cannot possibly read every work solemnly or gravely, for he will read in the same spirit that the author wrote. What is meant lightly, he will take lightly. What is meant gravely, he will take gravely. He will enjoy a kickshaw as a kickshaw and a tragedy as a tragedy. He will never commit the error of trying to munch whipped cream as if it were venison." So one of the things we have to do when we approach a book is we have to understand how is the book to be tasted? How are we to approach it? How are we to read it? Is it satire? Is it comedy? Is it tragedy? Third, we need to underline significant parts. Jot notes, note recurring symbols, keep a commonplace book nearby, turn down corners. You are going to interact with the book as you go. And I like what Susan Wise Bauer says. She says, marking a book is a good thing. It's okay to get books in the library, but she says, you're grown-ups now. Go buy a book if you can. Own your own copy so that you can mark in it, so that you can turn down pages, so that you can really handle it and interact with it. And if you can't, if you have to get it from the library or borrow it from somebody else and you know that they're going to get really angry if you give it back and it's all marked up and dog-eared, then she said, keep a commonplace book. Just keep a notebook with you and jot down those things. And the things you're going to ask as you go in that first reading are things like this. You're going to focus on the plot. What happens in the story? What's going on? Notice how does the author order the events that are going on? Is it a chronological order? Is it an order that's highlighting particular times and events or places? Why does the author order the events in the way that he or she does? What's the story's most important event? You're going to focus on personalities. And by personalities, I mean the characters in the story. But I like that word personalities because they aren't just static names on a paper. They're not just characters. They're personalities. You know who they are by how they act. You know them by their fruit. For instance, how are characters portrayed? There once was a boy named Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. His parents called him Eustace Clarence, and masters called him Scrub. I can't tell you how his friends spoke to him, for he had none. He didn't call his father and mother, but Harold and Alberta. They were very up-to-date and advanced people. They were vegetarians, non-smokers, and teetotalers, and wore a special kind of underclothes. He says Eustace liked books if they were books of information and had pictures of grain elevators or of fat foreign children doing exercises in model schools. So the Voyage of the Dawn Treader begins with this wonderful description of Eustace. And in his describing of Eustace, Lewis also gives you some insight into the time in which he's writing, the things that were going on, and his view on the world, or at least the things that are wrong with the world. So we're going to look at plot. We'll look at personalities. How do they act? How do they speak? How do they change or resist change? How do they view the world around them? Do these personalities, do these characters, do they act or are they acted upon? Sometimes the main character in a book will always be the initiator. Sometimes the main character book may initiate one or two actions in the whole novel and be the recipient of all the actions. Third, we'll look at theme. Theme is the story within the story. What's the story expressing about our world? And as you begin to ask questions about theme, now we're going to begin to move into that logic stage of reading. And as we move into the logic stage, I think it's very important that we remember that a novel does not present us with an argument. We are not reading novels to dissect arguments. It invites us to enter another world. J.R.R. Tolkien described it this way. He said, what really happens is that the story maker proves a successful sub-creator. He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it while you are, as it were, inside. So as long as you're inside his world, you are to believe and give yourself over to the laws according to the world he has created. It has to be believable. You have to believe that what is happening could happen. The moment disbelief arises, the spell's broken, the magic, or rather art, has failed. So the moment you begin to say, oh, that couldn't happen, that's ridiculous, that would never take place. The moment you start to disbelieve, Tolkien says the magic's gone. The spell's broken. You're no longer in that world. I think it's crucial for us to understand the secondary world of the story before we question the primary world of the author. So before we begin to step back and question and analyze and try to see some of the deeper things in a book, we have to immerse ourselves in the story first. We have to get a sense of that secondary story that the author has sub-created first. Again, Lewis says it this way. He said the necessary condition of all good reading is to get ourselves out of the way. The necessary condition of all good reading is just to get ourselves out of the way. The grammar stage, that tasting of the book, that does that. Do I see and feel and hear the other world? Is there a realism to it? Is it solid and consistent within itself? Is there a depth to it? Can I sympathize with the people who live there? Do I understand their wants and desires and problems? Even if it's a completely foreign world to me, there are things within it that I can resonate with in that world. And that brings us to that logic stage. The logic stage answers the why and the how questions. Now we begin to swallow and let it go inside of us. So let's begin with some questions about the world the author has sub-created. So we need to ask about this world. Is this secondary world set in the realities of our own world, or is it set in another world not bound by the universe as we know it? What world has he sub-created? Is it bound by the realities of our world, or does it follow another law? A great example of this would be the difference between science fiction and fantasy. Do you know the difference between science fiction and fantasy? Science fiction, as crazy as it can get sometimes, still has to be plausible. You may transport to another planet, but you do it on some ship that has been built or some new technology that has been developed. You may become invisible, but you're going to become invisible because of some new technological gadget that has been created. That's science fiction. Science fiction is about the machines, the creations, the technology. Fantasy isn't governed by those things. Fantasy, you can put a ring on your finger and you disappear. Fantasy, you put a ring on your finger and you're transported to another world. So does it have to be governed by our rules, or is there another set of rules? If it's set in our world, then you want to ask these questions. How does the author communicate these realities? How does the author communicate the realities of our world? Is it primarily psychological, or is it physical? Is it by detailed descriptions of the place, the surroundings, the landscape? Do they craft that kind of world, that kind of realism, or is it more psychological, where it's with the thoughts, the emotions, the turmoil, the drama of the individual, the inward things, where really the setting doesn't matter? You could take that story and set it anywhere, and it would work. It kind of just fades into the background. If it's set in a once upon a time world, what are the connections the author is trying to draw to our own world? How does the author then, in that context, answer the questions of reality? For example, in John Bunyan's classic, Pilgrim's Progress, you have this scene where Christian and Hopeful are locked up by the giant Despair at Doubting Castle. And Christian has all but given up hope of escape. The giant takes them out every day and beats them, throws them back in. Tomorrow you're going to die. Takes them back out again the next day, beats them, throws them back in the cage. Tomorrow you're going to die. So this wears them down. Christian in particular is worn down, and he loses all hope. Hopeful tries to get him to sing, tries to get him to maintain hope, and finally Christian he's done. And it's in that darkest moment when he's ready just to give it up and die that they do begin to sing hymns. And they begin to unroll a scroll, and they begin to read from it. And as they do, a key falls out. And this key unlocks the cage. And the name of the key is promise. And all along, they had the key to their freedom. Now, that type of fable is what we call allegory, where there's a direct connection between some part of the story and some other literal reality. And one of the things you see Bunyan is showing his reader is this inward reality of a soul enslaved by doubt. Everything about that world is otherworldly. We don't have giants. We don't have castles, at least not here in Monroe. We don't have those types of things. But that inward struggle with doubt, that inward struggle of making a wrong decision and struggling to accept the forgiveness of that decision. A way of escape from despair. Notice how he pictures doubt. Doubt's a castle. It's a formidable structure. Notice how he personifies despair. Despair is this flesh-eating giant. He beats them down every day, but he does not kill them. For what you begin to realize as you read through that narrative is they can't kill them. They are expecting them to kill themselves. They threaten death every day, and yet they are hoping that they will take their own lives so that they can then eat them. He loses his strength in the light. There's a sliver of light that comes through, and the giant immediately, the strength is drained from him. He hates the singing of the hymns. Bunyan, with this fantastical world, is relating to us this reality that resonates with us all. Another type is speculation, where the world itself represents ideas taken to their extremes, like Brave New World, 1984, where the world is representative of this idea, and if you just carried that idea to the extreme, this is what you would get. G.K. Chesterton described the world of his story, The Man Who Was Thursday, on the day before his death. He said that many had misinterpreted his theme as one portraying God as both order and chaos, what he called a pantomime ogre. They misunderstood because, Chesterton asserts, they forgot to read the title page. They misunderstood what Chesterton was saying because he said the clue was in the subtitle. The man who was Thursday, a nightmare. He said this was not intended to describe the world as it was, or as I thought it was, even when my thoughts were considerably less settled than they are now. It was intended to describe the world of wild doubt and despair, which the pessimists were generally describing at that date, with just a gleam of hope and some double meaning of the doubt, which even the pessimists felt in some fitful fashion. He was describing the world of the critics of his day. He was describing the reality of the pessimists and their view of the world. And I think once we understand the world in which the story takes place, then we can begin to go deeper in asking the other questions. So let me just run through some of these other questions. Again, we don't have time really to dwell on these. I wish we did, but you have them there, so let me just run through them. Now you're ready to ask some of these questions. What does a central character or characters want? Again, our first reading through the book should have helped us distinguish those major, minor characters. Elizabeth Bennet, she wants to get married. Robinson Crusoe, he wants autonomy. Ahab, he wants the whale. What's the central character want? And what is standing in their way? For Elizabeth, her family's standing in her way. She's not marriable because of her family dysfunction. For Robinson Crusoe, his father is in the way. God is in the way. And then what strategy do they pursue in order to overcome the obstacle? Now, I want to say that these last two questions, what's standing in their way and what strategy do they pursue to overcome it, may reveal a deeper desire than first thought. That Elizabeth Bennet's major obstacle may not necessarily be her family. That Robinson Crusoe's major obstacle may not necessarily be his father. That Ahab may not necessarily simply want the whale. There are deeper desires at play here. Is there a change outside of themselves, or is the change inward? Do their circumstances change, or do their hearts change? Do the obstacles get removed, or do the desires get transformed? And then what's the result? You ask, who's telling the story? Is it first person? A limited perspective, but immediate. They can tell you what they see, taste, touch, feel. Is it from an omniscient narrator? Someone who can see and explain everything going on, even the thoughts, emotions, motives, everything that's happening. That was typically the way it happened pre-18th century or so. That was a popular one, and then we kind of moved away from that. There's a reason for that. They moved away from that point of view. Why does the author choose that particular point of view? Why does the author choose certain points of view to tell the story? There's a reason. What do they gain or lose from the choice? Right? So no matter what choice you choose of how to tell the story, there are things you gain from that point of view. There are things that you lose from that point of view. What do we gain or lose from it? Fifth, what's the setting? How does the environment react to the story? Does it reflect the emotions and problems of the character? Is it indifferent and unresponsive to the struggles? If you're reading a story and the environment is completely unresponsive, completely static to what's going on in the story, could that tell you something about their view of the world? How the world operates? How the world maybe is this mechanical thing? I'm amazed. I was reading through again recently The Lord of the Rings, and I was just amazed at not only Tolkien's description of that world, but how the world interacts. The world almost kind of comes alive. The mountains are like these real obstacles. They almost seem to respond to the challenge. Everything is just this interactive thing that's happening in the story. What do the beginnings and endings tell us? Does the ending have a resolution or what they call a logical exhaustion? Meaning there's not really a resolution. You get the sense that things are just going to continue on as they are. My wife hates those types of stories. Things don't get wrapped up. And they just kind of leave you to say, well, it's just going to keep going like it is over and over and over with no end. Endings demonstrate a certain philosophy about the nature of human life. Endings of stories will often demonstrate to you our view of the ending of the story. They are not simply isolated stories often. And that moves us into our last phase, which is the rhetoric phase. And what I would say is the rhetoric phase is really where you need to think about discussing with a friend. As you've tasted, as you've swallowed, you're ready to digest it. I think this is the point where if you can find someone to talk through this book with, this is the time to do it. This answers the question, so what? How should this story shape me? And I think as we move into that phase, and let me just back up for a second. Susan Wise Bauer says, ideally, you would just reread the book again. But she also understands you're probably not going to do that. Read it through once to taste it, and then you should read it through again to swallow and digest it. She said, you don't have to do that. It's better if you do, but you can just go back through those things that you've marked, those things that you've dog-eared, those things that you've highlighted, because now you understand the story, and now you can begin to go back to certain parts and dive in a little deeper. Okay? So you don't have to do that. So one of the things you're going to ask here is, what's the author's historical setting? And I think this is a big one because we tend to read a lot of our own cultural presuppositions, our own cultural context into the stories. And I was reading a lot of the critics of some of the good literature, the English and American literature, they so often do this. They just read back into the story and they place modern day issues, modern day problems, modern day things back on the author. And some of those things, most of those things, they aren't even on that culture's radar. Some of those things haven't even been defined and discussed by that author's context. So what we need to do is try to find out, what's the world of the author? What's the world that Milton was writing in? What's the world that Shakespeare was writing in? What's the world that Dante was writing in? Those worlds, they are so different than our world. Their contexts are so different than our contexts. And I think it'd be helpful to understand where they're coming from. Once you've done that, then you're going to ask questions such as, does God exist? You say, well, the book doesn't mention God, so how am I going to answer that? Is there a governing force in the universe? Is there something governing the story? And is that thing personal? Is it a person? Does he reveal himself? Does he act in a consistent way? What's he like? What part does he play in the world? So does God exist? If yes, then ask those questions. How is he revealed? How do they know him? How does he react in the world? If no, then what forces are at work? Because often what you'll find is, if there isn't this divine mover, then there is this mechanical Darwinianism. It's hopeless to fight against the forces of nature. The world's just going to keep turning and grinding, and we, as just part of this spinning ball, are just going to get ground up in it. So let's just make the most of it. Let's just survive. Let's just have our moment, whatever it is. It's just this grind it out. Maybe it's this nihilism. There's just no meaning to anything. It's all just meaningless and useless, and what's the point? Maybe it's this quest for free will. It's interesting because if you watch some shows now, or that's a popular phrase that's starting to pop up, I've noticed, particularly among the science fiction and fantasy genres, this idea of free will. As a Christian, I think, well, they're just pushing back against God's sovereignty. They just don't like that God is governing the universe, and they want to be free of him. I don't think that's the case. I don't even think they're aware of that. I think they're pushing back against this mechanical, evolutionary fatalism that they've been fed for so many years. They're saying, there's no meaning in that. There's no purpose in that. Surely life is more than instinct and processes and death. I think they're pushing back against that. They don't know what to push back with. But they're asking those questions. So, if it isn't a God, what forces are at work? What does it mean to be human? How does the story define humanity? Where do we come from? Where are we going? What stands in the way? How do we overcome those obstacles? These are the big questions of life. What does it mean to be truly human? What is true? How do we know what's true? How does God reveal himself as true? How do we understand and make sense of the world around us? What is true according to the author's perspective? What is good? As we've immersed ourselves in the story, we need to ask the question, how does the story define good? Where does this goodness come from? How is this goodness portrayed in the characters? What are the enemies of this good? How does the story answer the question, what is good? And then what is beauty? Does the author draw with sharp contrasts, light and darkness, or does the author kind of draw with blurred lines? How does the author present beauty? Is it subjective or is it objective? Is it something to rise to, or is it something just to kind of accept and feel your way through? To accept who you are as beautiful? Or is it, no, this is beauty and we're rising to this no matter what it is that's getting in our way? This is where we're going. Is there an argument in the book? Again, the novel's not an argument, but there are ideas that present themselves within the story. So we do have to ask the question, what are those ideas that the author is presenting? What is some underlying arguments? And then what happens to the main character? What happens to him? What happens to her? And why? And then do you agree? In what sense is the book true? Do you agree with the author's representation in the story of what governs the universe, of our place in the world, of how we interact with the world, of what our purpose is, of what is true? Do you agree with what the author defines as good? Do you agree with what the author defines as beautiful or not? Great literature is not life in the raw. Great literature is not this kind of realism where it's just life just kind of thrown out there, raw and undefined, and just, hey, this is just real life. No, great literature is life structured. It's chaos ordered. It brings that real life into a story that we can see it and we can make sense of it in that context. And I'll end with one of my favorite quotes, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions. I don't like anything here at all, said Frodo. Step or stone, breath or bone, earth, air, and water all seem accursed, but so our path is laid. Yes, that's so, said Sam. And we shouldn't be here at all if we'd known more about it before we started. But I suppose it's often that way. The brave things in the old tales and songs, Mr. Frodo, adventures as I used to call them. I used to think that they were things the wonderful folk of the stories went out and looked for because they wanted them, because they were exciting and life was a bit dull, kind of a sport, as you might say. But that's not the way of it with the tales that really mattered, or the ones that stay in the mind. Folks seem to have been just landed in them. Usually their paths were laid that way, as you put it. But I expect they had lots of chances, like us, of turning back, only they didn't. And if they had, we shouldn't know because they'd have been forgotten. We hear about those that just went on, and not all to a good end, mind you, at least not to what folk inside a story and not outside it call a good end. You know, coming home and finding things all right, though not quite the same, like old Mr. Bilbo. But those aren't always the best tales to hear, though they may be the best tales to get landed in. I wonder what sort of a tale we've fallen into. I wonder, said Frodo, but I don't know. And that's the way of a real tale. Take anyone that you're fond of. You may know or guess what kind of a tale it is, happy ending or sad ending, but the people in it don't know, and you don't want them to. So where do you start? I have given you some resources here that I think will be helpful, because I know it can be a daunting task to know, well, what books do I start with? How do I get a grasp on this? This seems all very overwhelming, asking all these questions and doing all these steps. And I've given you 3 that I think are very helpful. One is Invitation to the Classics by Os Guinness and Louise Cohen. A Politically Incorrect Guide to English and American Literature, that's Elizabeth Cantor. And then The Well-Educated Mind, which is Susan Wise Bauer. All 3 of those actually give you books that you should read. Recommended books, they give you suggestions of the best editions, the best translations. They walk you through a nice summary of what the book's about, some of the things you need to look for. Excellent resources there to get you started. So let's stop there and see if there are any questions.